Okay, let's spend a few minutes talking about the partner. And if the wife of Bath is one of the most attractive characters in English literature, the partner is one of the most unattractive. The source for this presentation is Helen Cooper again. Now, according to Cooper, both the structure and the main theme of the partner's prologue and tale align with what he states the theme of his sermons is, and that is that greed is the root of all evil. However, as we shall see, while the partner preaches against greed, it's the basis on which he lives his entire life. And we know from the beginning that the partner is really aware of his hypocrisy, and he even delights in it. Now, Cooper says that the structure of the prologue and tale, taken as a whole, deals with three sections. First, the partner details his techniques, as Cooper points out. He explains to the pilgrims exactly how he approaches the parishioners that he deals with in his travels. And it's important to note that the parishioners he works with have never met him before he visits their parish. He's a stranger to them, which allows him to defraud them out of money and escape before his lies are discovered. Next, he emphasizes that his only goal is to make money, or as a secondary goal if necessary, to rant. While he acknowledges that his listeners might learn a moral tale from his sermon, he states that he doesn't care whether they do or not. He has zero interest in these people or in their eternal souls. All he cares about is making money. And working as a partner provides him easy, dependable access to cash without having to work very hard. That's all he cares about, and any benefit that his audience gains from their interactions with him is purely coincidental in his mind. And finally, he shows how that greed is his way of life and how that relates to the process of storytelling. As Cooper points out, in working with parishioners, the partner addresses only the everyday material concerns of their rural lives. Cooper says that tactic is part of his success. We have to remember that rural life in medieval England was really difficult, and the people were often very, very, very poor. So, material concerns about their livestock and their crops, those would be very important to them. There's certainly nothing wrong with dealing with those concerns. And a good cleric, in other words, a good member of the Catholic Church, whether it's a parson or a priest or a bishop, they're all called clerics, okay? A good cleric would work with his parishioners to deal with their material concerns. But a good cleric would move beyond the physical and the material needs of the parishioners to address concerns of salvation and the state of the eternal soul, as Cooper says. The partner never moves beyond the material because there is more money in addressing the material concerns, and making money is his only goal. In fact, as Cooper says, the language that the partner uses actually downgrades the spiritual to the material. For example, his description of himself as looking like a dove when he preaches decreases the symbol of the Holy Spirit that's found in the New Testament to a purely animalistic representation, and a very unattractive one at that. And then, in addition, as Cooper says, he also trivializes the central concern of medieval life, which was the fear of eternal damnation, by comparing it to berry picking of all things. Cooper explains that the partner states that he has no interest in the life of work and poverty that are required of true religious leaders. He prefers money, wool, cheese, wine, and women to the fulfillment of being a spiritual leader. And, in fact, it doesn't appear that he sees that there is any fulfillment in the role of being a spiritual leader. At the beginning of the prologue, he appears to simply be more concerned with the trivial matters of the world, as Cooper points out. But by the end of the tale, he demonstrates that he has overtly rejected all religious values. As Cooper points out, the partner has a high regard for the value of storytelling, and that's part of his skill as a preacher. Medieval handbooks on preaching usually maintain that people love legends, and those handbooks applied numerous legends that priests could use in their sermons. As we discussed when we talked about the life of Bath, stories that are used to provide examples of points, and particularly in religious sermons and presentations, were called exemplars. The tale of the three revelers that seek death is an exemplar that demonstrates the dangers of greed. The trio starts out, of course, to find and kill death, but they're deterred from their goal when they find the gold. At that point, each of them starts to focus on how to keep all the gold for himself, and not share it with the other two. Ironically, the trio does end up finding death by dying. Now, Cooper goes on to tell us that stories, especially exemplars, were expected to carry a theme that would be spiritually profitable for listeners in medieval Europe. And the partner does state that there might be some spiritual profit in his tale, because even though he's amoral, he can tell a moral tale as good as anyone else can. But the spiritual profitability, indeed any profitability, that his tale holds for his listeners is of absolutely no interest to the partner. Oh, he's very concerned with profitability, all right, but only in terms of financial responsibility, financial profitability to him. As Cooper points out, the partner's approach to the tale's profitability is yet another example of his converting the spiritual to the material, which is the opposite of what a caring cleric would do. Therefore, Cooper states, while the story might draw some listeners away from sin, the partner's use of it is still morally reprehensible because his purpose is to exploit religion for his personal financial gain. As we recall, that's the definition of the Simonists that Dante assigns to the eighth circle of hell in the Inferno. Cooper goes on to say that the partner's prologue and tale demonstrate that he has a great deal of knowledge about evil, particularly, of course, the evil of greed, as well as the tavern sins, and those would be overeating, drinking, womanizing, and gambling. But Cooper says that the prologue and tale also clearly demonstrate that the partner uses all this knowledge that he has of evil not to choose good, but to exploit it. Now, Cooper says that sometimes one sin does lead to another. But when that happens, and sin is pictured as feeding on sin, it's usually in an agony of despair. But the partner is not despairing. His depiction of sin feeding on sin, not at all. As a matter of fact, he's really self-congratulatory about the whole thing. He admits to knowing that what he does is immoral and sinful. But instead of showing remorse, he's proud that he's so successful at sinning and earning a profit from it. Now, let's talk about irony a little bit here. And Cooper didn't state this, but I think it's a really interesting point that we should look at, especially since, as we noted in discussing the general prologue, that Chaucer is a master of irony. He uses it throughout the Canterbury Tales, and we definitely see an example of this irony within the story that the young partners tell. It gets a little confusing. Now, before they find the gold, the three revelers have a very specific goal, and that is to find death and kill it so that no one will ever die. And while they're on the road to find death, they meet an old man who can't die, no matter how much he prays to. Because of his advanced age, this guy is clearly miserable and gets very little joy out of life. The revelers are, of course, very scornful of the old man, as the young almost always are of the old. But the irony is that if the revelers are successful in their attempt to kill death, they're dooming themselves as well as everyone else to the miserable existence that the old man is living in. Not dying is not the same thing as not aging. And no matter what we do, the body wears out if we continue to live. It doesn't matter how many healthy lifestyle choices we make, it's not going to stop the natural deterioration of the physical body if we live long enough. The simple truth is that people age. All people age. You will age too. And yeah, healthy choices can delay how soon we experience the effects of aging, granted. But if we live long enough, the body will eventually wear out, and we'll lose our ability to cope with life, much less enjoy it. Now, since the revelers want to do away with death entirely, they're basically extending old age for centuries. They're not going to be adding to the end of life hundreds of years during which they'll be eternally 20 years old. They're adding hundreds of years during which they will be old, sick, and yearning for death. Okay. The partner describes how he manipulates people. And it sounds that in dealing with parishioners, he's successful at it. But the partner gets confused at the end of the tale. And an interesting point about the prologue, about the partner's prologue and tale, is that the partner fails so abysmally at doing what Chaucer does so well, and that's handling multiple layers of narrative. Now, the partner demonstrates in his prologue that he's fully aware that he is explaining to the pilgrims what he does when he visits parishioners and preaches. He's very forthcoming about his interests and goals, as clearly he wouldn't be if he were addressing the actual parishioners that he was trying to get money out of. But as he relates the exemplar that he uses when he preaches and addresses parishioners, and that would be the story of the young revelers, he gets so caught up in the act that he forgets his context. He forgets whom he is addressing and in what situation. And we know that because he attempts to sell the pilgrims all the junk that he's already told was garbage. And he tries to sell it just as if he were addressing parishioners, in spite of the fact that he's talking to people that he's already admitted to that what he's selling is worthless. He's only dealing with 2 layers of narrative there. And even at that simple task, he forgets who his audience is and his purpose for telling the tale. he gets confused, and if the Pilgrims didn't know him so well, his audience would have gotten confused too. Now Chaucer, on the other hand, never makes that mistake. If we look at the Pardoner's prologue and tale, we see that what we're actually working with are 4 separate narrative layers. First of all, there's the story that the 3 revelers tell about, or of the 3 revelers searching for death. That's a story in and of itself. But that story is actually inside another story about a pardoner, and a pardoner telling a group of pilgrims how he does his work. Now, if we think back to the general prologue, we also realize that the story of the pardoner is being reported by Chaucer, but not Chaucer the author. It's being reported by the Chaucer that is a character that is traveling with the pilgrims. Because remember, Chaucer's very careful to set himself up as a fictional character, so that he can say that if any of these tales are offended, or if you find anything offensive in this, gee, I'm sorry, I'm just reporting what they said, and that's what a good reporter of an incident does, and I'm sorry it's offensive. You can skip the offensive parts if you want to. Now, the person that said that is a work of fiction, because Chaucer, who is the author of the Canterbury Tales, obviously is responsible for everything in them. Okay? So when we read the story of the revelers, we are reading a story within a story within a story. That's 3 layers of fiction that we're navigating through. And yet, Chaucer handles all that layering of narratives so well that we don't get confused, we don't get lost. We are just as caught up in the reveler's story as we would be if that was all we were reading. Now, Chaucer does this throughout the Canterbury Tales, all this layering of narratives, where pilgrims tell tales and characters in their tales tell tales. In the Nun's Priest's Tale, for example, at one point we are dealing with 7 layers of fiction. That would be a story inside a story, 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 inside the Canterbury Tales, which is also fiction. Okay? That's 7 layers of fiction. And yet never once do readers find that confusing. Chaucer handles that just beautifully, and it's one of the beautiful things about his writing. So I just thought I'd mention it so that you would have a little bit greater understanding of what makes Chaucer a great author. Okay, if you have any other questions or anything that you would like me to address or answer, don't forget that you can always email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.oakey@csn.edu. Thank you so much for paying attention to this little presentation. I hope it helped you enjoy and understand the Pardoner's prologue and tale a little bit better, and encourages you to find out a little bit more about Chaucer's work. We'll be talking again soon, I'm sure, and in the meantime, enjoy yourself.